I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs and the host of our weekly live video series called Center Stage. We're in the midst of our second season, all about the magic of teams, what makes them cohesive, high-performing, and happy. And in this season, we'll be covering 4 different chapters. The first one around team dynamics, we wrapped up 2 weeks ago, and the team here will drop the link in case you missed it and you want to rewatch some of it. And this episode is the first episode of our second chapter, all about building teams. Our guests will be answering questions about building diverse and inclusive teams, how to recruit the right talent, how to ensure distributed teams are cohesive. Myself and my guests will be on LinkedIn Live every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. UAE time, and we'll share insights, experiences, and perspectives on this chapter for the next few sessions. And before we begin, as always, please do show us some love. Give this video a like. If you think that someone would be interested in the topic we're covering, tag them or share the link with them. And as always, do ask your questions in the comment section below. We'll try our best to get through them while we're here, and hopefully Jonathan will have time to answer a few of them. And if not, we'll go back and answer them later when the episode is over. Our guest today is Jonathan Yeo. He's the founder of The Potential Space. He is an inclusive culture strategist, a talent development expert, a leadership coach, and an inspiring speaker and facilitator. He worked for 10 years at Apple, designing and delivering inclusion and diversity solutions, as well as leadership curricula and development programs for interpersonal skills. He has experience across a wide range of industries, including technology, education, marketing, arts, and entertainment. Jonathan has created and facilitated learning experiences that explore bias, identity, and allyship, and regularly facilitates workshops focused on team building, communication, and collaboration skills. He has a BA in communication from the University of Technology, Sydney, and he's currently undertaking the Executive Master in Change program at INSEAD in Fontainebleau. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited that you're here.
Thanks, Marilyn. Me too. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let me introduce what we're going to be discussing today. Of course, the topic for this chapter is how to get the early days of a team right, because the early days of a team are such a huge determinant of its long-term success. And of course, we can't talk about teams without talking about how we start off on the right foot and how we establish a solid foundation. Now, if you Google how to build a great team, here's what you're going to find, right? You're going to find having clear goals, setting expectations, being mission focused, setting ground rules, methods of communication, decision-making, and defining roles, but also being respectful and embracing diversity. And in this episode, we're going to talk specifically about how our differences make us stronger. Jonathan and I will be discussing diversity in teams and how to create teams and environments that nurture and leverage that diversity. Teams that are diverse are, of course, known to be more productive, more innovative. There's dozens of studies around that, including one from BCG, which found that diversity in leadership teams can lead to up to a 19% increase in productivity. That's pretty impressive. We also know that diversity and inclusion requires fostering inclusion on so many different levels, from leadership to culture, from implementing the right norms and values, but also defined rules and policies. And of course, having a learning-oriented culture, which we're going to be talking about with Jonathan. So let's get started. I'm a big fan of definitions. So Jonathan, in your words, how would you define diversity and inclusion? Let's start there.
Yeah, so, the simplest starting point definitions, diversity is the ways in which we are different, and we can explore. So, there's a wide, panorama of all the ways that we can be different. And as you said, there's a lot of evidence now as to how that's important for a team. And I think a lot of us implicitly understand that we need differences. Inclusion, though, is often thought of as a state, and I think of it as an act. Like we don't just have inclusion, we work constantly to build inclusion. It happens through our actions. And so I think thinking about inclusion as an action rather than just a state of being is the way I like to define it.
I think that's a really great definition. Let's talk about diversity here for a second. When we think about diversity, a lot of us tend to focus on what I call phenotype diversity, which is like what we can see when we look at someone, whether it's their gender or their race or their height, or which language they speak. But when we spoke to Dr. Vinika Rao in our conference, she mentioned something that I found was really interesting, and I'd love for you to comment on that. She said there's the inherent diversity of ethnicity, race, gender, age, and then there's acquired diversity, diversity that comes from experience and background, which influences what you bring to an organization or a team. And it's more difficult to measure, but equally important. What are your thoughts on inherent diversity, what we're born into, and then what we acquire along the way? And how can teams make sure that they're paying attention to both?
Yeah, and it was interesting when I read that, because it's a parallel to a lot of the work that I do with organizations, and tend to focus on it from what you mentioned up front, which is the visible and the invisible. And I was thinking through this, and there's this interesting overlap and parallel to those things. So I think a lot of what we might consider visible diversity, like you said, sort of phenotype type diversity, largely overlaps with that inherent. There's sort of there's a big overlap, not entirely, and similarly, acquired might be more in the invisible, more tend towards the invisible. So I think where I find the sort of visible, invisible gets people thinking more broadly, and thinking about it's sort of this inherent idea. What that starts to tap into is this idea that often comes up in discussions about diversity is what is inherent may not be what is key to you. So what you might have acquired might become a more significant part of your identity, or equally what is invisible might be a more important part than what's visible or what's inherent to you. So there can be a lot of variation there. So what I think it raises is what both ideas raise is the idea of we need to think about the parts of diversity that we don't necessarily see, that we don't necessarily think immediately about.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, because it allows more space for individuality in some way, to say that my visible diversity may not actually tell the whole story, and maybe actually what I've acquired over time and the experiences that I've chosen to be a part of perhaps contribute a lot more to who I am than what you can see or what meets the eye. Of course, every culture has cliches, but for example, as a Lebanese, I am very Lebanese, but I'm also not Lebanese at all if you look at the sum of my experience and who I've become. And so I think that telling both stories is such an important one.
Yeah, as an Australian who lives in the US, I sometimes lean into that Australian identity, and sometimes not. So I think the other one that comes to mind that I think is an interesting example is disability, right? Because disability can be either visible or invisible. It can be acquired or inherent. And, we tend to, when we think disability, automatically we go to the disabilities that we can see. And they may or may not be significant to that person. They may or may not be the things they want to identify. And likewise, what is unseen may be really important.
That's a really great point. And so how do you look at an organization or a team and are able to say that we can measure diversity, or that we can, say for sure that we are promoting diversity?
I have a lot of these conversations around measurement, and I think it really requires people to be able to balance both. Yes, there's important efforts around measurement, and there has to be an acceptance of it's qualitative as well. There's a certain point where you can't measure, because if we go into all the different categories, I mean, we could go on for we could get very minute and end up with thousands of things that we might want to observe or count, and particularly in smaller organizations, you quickly run into well, there's only 50 of us, so what does that mean? But what I've I've worked in a big tech organization where the measurement is often reliant on what particularly the US government looks for in terms of understanding underrepresented groups, and they make the categorizations. Of course, the reality of people's lived experiences is much more nuanced than those categorizations. And so what I particularly, you run into challenges in an organization with privacy, and that's really important to think about, because if you want to measure, you basically have to ask people. Now, oftentimes there's statutory requirements to ask that information, and then there's a lot of different countries where they explicitly do not allow you to ask that information. So you're always sort of grappling with that challenge with measurement. I've had some pretty successful work with smaller organizations where we do survey people, and we do it in an anonymous way so that no one's labeled, and we sort out the numbers so that none of those smaller numbers are identifying. And the power of that is that then you can present back to the organization and give them a picture. And what it elicits is a lot of that sort of invisible or acquired aspects of diversity that do give a broader picture. Now, I think the challenge is not taking away from the key focuses. Now, obviously, in the US particularly, there's been, in some ways, the fortunate outcomes have been a real focus on particularly, the experiences of Black employees, and that's been really raised up, which has been fantastic. And you don't want to lose that focus. You want to kind of add to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And to your point about it being very different from really large corporations to smaller companies, we have a question here from the audience. Marie asks, if you're in a small team of 8 to 10 people, is it easier to have a diverse and inclusive organization in small teams or in bigger teams? That really resonates with me, because we're 10 people, 8 girls or 7 girls out of the 10. And I'm always like sitting here being like, you assume that because you're a woman and in some case feel like you already represent diversity, that you will never be guilty of like having not a diverse team. But it's a really good question. Like for small companies or small teams, like how do you build that in from the beginning?
Yeah, and I think where a lot of these conversations, when I have them, end up landing is in a place of how can we be more diverse rather than what is the right level of diversity. Because, obviously, again, and it's a great question, because ultimately people exist in small teams, even if you're in a big organization. So, we would often have discussions. You run into that challenge of, I'm the only something in the room. Well, when you're in a team of 4, 5, 8, 10, yeah, you're probably the only, you could well be the only, and it's not, that's not a call to like, oh, we've got to go and hire more of, this category so that someone's, we're all actually going to probably be sort of the only person in the room at some point. But I think, where I would, where I encourage people to look at it is like, what's the community you're operating in? Are you or serving as a business? Are you representative of that community broadly? And that's sort of a good kind of foundational layer.
That's a really interesting one, because it looks at how you as a company can mirror the ecosystem that you're supporting or creating value in. That's a really interesting way of looking at it, actually. And so I have a question that kind of relates to that, which is I quickly touched in the introduction about the benefits of diversity. Talk to us about, what you see being the great advantages of having diverse environments. One of the things that I always talk about is the resilience. I actually think that when you have diverse teams, they deal with crises or stress or difficult situations in very different ways as individuals, and therefore creates an opportunity that when there is a difficult moment to deal with, perhaps diversity can really support with developing organizational resilience. What can you say are like the real positive impacts of true diversity on the performance and value creation of companies?
Yeah, I think, again, and as you mentioned, there's an increasing number of studies out there that sort of measure the impact certainly on innovation, creativity, just the ability to, so much of work now is about, business process improvement and stuff. And that requires people to be willing to come in with different perspectives. I think on a personal level, you know, if I think when I entered the workforce, my mindset was very much, you know, I want to find the like-minded people and just, you know, connect. And, you know, and that's the way I approached work for quite a long time. And, you know, I'd sort of like be annoyed by people, you know, who weren't aligned, you know, and then, you know, what I learned obviously over time is like, oh, no, their ideas are often better. My ideas are made better by being challenged by other perspectives and other ideas. Yeah, and you know, I say that because I think that is a lot of people's journeys. You know, we look for commonality, we look for similarity. We're wired for that because that, you know, we feel like we belong. But then the next level journey is to look then for difference and to be comfortable with that challenge.
I love that idea. You and I discussed it when we first met, and how this process is both about finding commonality and finding points of differences. And you mentioned earlier inclusion as being a process, right? And I really want us to maybe talk about some examples or stories or practices that you can put in place to kind of develop that process. One example of something that we did in our team is one of our team members, Billy, when he first joined, he you know, suggested to do this exercise with us where he made us answer a few survey questions about norms and values, and then he compared, because we are a diverse team from the point of view of like where we grew up and kind of our cultural references. And so he then compared our individual answers to the average measured in our cultures. And we had this big session where, you know, whether it was about like discipline or decision making or whatever it was, like we were able to like sit down and be like, oh my God, I had no idea that, you know, like Tala was so far up on the scale on this one. I'm really surprised. And we're able to have this really fun and wonderful experience to learn about one another. Do you have any practices that you particularly love in terms of helping people engage in that inclusion process?
One of what you just shared reminded me of, you know, there's, and I've done some variations on this activity, but it's basically getting people to talk about how they're not like their stereotype. You know, whether it's you know, an ethnic stereotype or a job role stereotype or something like that. Because I think one of the challenges of this area is that we talk about categories, and those categories immediately bring stereotypes with them. And of course, stereotypes is, you know, a type of bias that we're then trying to avoid. But we're kind of propagating it in some ways with the categories. And so I find that one a really fun one, because it's like, you know, tell me how you're, you know, basically challenge the stereotypes that I have. Because we're none of us are, you know, there'll be elements as we talked about, but we all deviate from whatever our identities are to many degrees. So that's a fun one. I think the other thing that I mean, and we were talking before, you know, and I'll plug your card game that you've just released. But, you know, I think anything that gets people to talk just about who they are, and there's so many different ways to do that, and I'm sure everyone's done lots of different icebreakers. For me, that is an ongoing thing. I mean, we are such complicated individuals. There is so much to unwrap. It's not just the thing that you do once a year at your team offsite. You know, it should be a regular discovery, both as a team and then as obviously individuals connecting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, in our card game, and we also have it on our tool, Aeon, we have these questions that people can answer at the same time. And then it's always just wonderful to kind of compare whether it's about how they perceive work or stories from their childhood, or even something as simple as like what cartoon they used to watch. You know, like we all think we're so different, then we end up having watched all the same things growing up. Or sometimes not at all, and we discover like some really strange cartoon that is really fascinating. And I think having those moments where you create space for that conversation and that storytelling is such an important part of it. We have about 1 billion questions from the audience. I'm trying to sort through them here. But one is about actually hiring diversity. So let's talk about that too. So someone here is asking, Rhea is asking, how explicit are you about the diversity aspect during the hiring process? Do you have any specific kind of criteria, or is that actually like really a bad idea to go and be like, okay, we need to hire someone who's going to make us look more diverse? Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, and it's definitely, it's a balance, right? Because you can definitely, you know, and I've seen it fall off the wrong end. Good intentions here can often go wrong. So, you know, because particularly you can easily create perverse incentives. And I think what people need to keep in mind is no matter how large your organization, you're generally hiring for a smaller team. So the example I often give is if the messaging feels like, hey, you know what, I get to hire one person this year. Oh, they have to be in one of these diverse categories. You know, that's the message I've heard from above because we're trying to increase our representation. That can create, you know, if that person makes a decision to hire someone who is maybe not as well suited for the role to meet a diversity criteria that they've perceived is important, it's well-meaning and it can work, but it can also go wrong, particularly if the sense is that that person comes in then under the cloud of, oh, I'm a diversity hire, and that's the way everyone's going to see me. That's the way I'm going to be positioned. So it's really delicate, and I think it's really important that companies are explicit about that. And you know, one of the ways I think the best approach is you talk about diversifying your funnel when you're looking at candidates. And your conclusion, it should always still be to hire the best candidate you can find. But who's in that funnel, and how do you make sure that the process that's narrowing down to that best candidate is fair and unbiased? And so that's a lot of the work I've done, is in that space of, you know, what does a fair, unbiased hiring process look like? You know, how are you managing your interview panels? How are you doing behavioral interviews? All that sort of stuff to create, you know, a level playing field. And the important thing is the sourcing as well.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. It's about sourcing more diverse, and then eventually you will end up with the right candidate in place, rather than trying to do this closer to the bottom of the funnel where your decision between two candidates is not based necessarily on their fit, but maybe some
I
idea.
think one thing I'll add there is, because it's one that comes up a lot, is, you know, a lot of organizations had lent very heavily into referrals, employee referrals. Because you kind of go, well, you know, they know, and then you really get into that sort of cultural fit thing. It's like, oh, they're coming already with an idea of fit, and it's dangerous because, of course, you know, you tend to then, you're drawing the same people from the same pools, and often those might be sort of monocultural in one way or another. So you propagate that. And I think the idea, one of the things I talk a lot about, you know, is I really lean into that idea that's been out there for a while around, you know, culture add, not culture fit.
Nice. Oh, that's a good one. I've never heard this before. Culture add, not culture fit. And actually, we have, again, two questions from the audience here around personal values versus organizational values, right? That's another form of diversity. And I guess a way of looking at cultural add versus cultural fit is also that you don't hire people who automatically agree with every value and every way of working, and they're able to come in and say, well, actually, I think this is really dumb, you know, and at least open a debate and kind of bring in a new perspective. So a couple questions here from the audience, again, around cultural values. How do you deal with team members who have differing cultural values versus the group or versus the organization? And then another question, and I'll bundle them, and then maybe you can give us a broad answer on values here, is that a big part of kind of enabling diverse thinking is actually becoming acceptant of each other's personal values, right? Like, yes, of course, there are the company values, but they don't override who you are as a person. So that's something that Tom Marston has said in one of our previous conferences. And so Maya, who's on our team, is asking, actually, how do you find that balance between creating space for people's personal values and whatever kind of richness they bring to the conversation, but also aligning them to the organizational values or the team values?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is, you know, if there are company values that are pretty clear, then obviously you want to hire to those values. I wouldn't necessarily argue, oh, you want to bring in someone who's counter to those values, because at a certain point, you know, if that's what the company has agreed on, that is the company and their values. Now, usually the reality is, of course, you know, it's nuanced, right? So, but I wouldn't sort of say, oh yeah, you need to bring in all these contrarians who actually don't agree with what your company is and stands for, because that just is going to create chaos at some point. I think when it comes to, you know, personal values, I will say, I think that I think we've come a long way in most workplaces. I think, you know, in that, you know, even just reflecting the last decade or two, I think there's much better general acceptance of, say, differing religious values. Of course, there's still conflict and there's still disagreement, but there's a much healthier tone of like, oh yes, people come from, you know, and that's okay and that's supported. And I think the big one that is really a pain point across much of the globe now is the different political sort of affiliation or values. And I think, you know, to be honest, I've worked with a number of organizations when I go in and want to talk about aspects of diversity, and I want to talk about political affiliation as an aspect of diversity. And quite a lot will say, let's not go there. It's too much. But I think we've got to get there. And I get that, you know, but we've got to get there eventually. And I don't see it as that dissimilar to, you know, where we're at with religious belief. You know, it's a form of belief. And so I think, you know, I think we can get there. And I think we have to try and get there, because, and I think my hope would be that plays out then in the public arena as well, that we can get more towards a civil discourse on political difference.
Yeah, we've seemed to have lost the ability for dialogue, I think, and lost the ability for grasping complexity and accepting that actually the world is a very complex place. We seem to find comfort in polarizing opinions these days. So yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
There's so much work to be done around re-enabling dialogue. And actually, that's something that we also wanted to talk to you about. You know, your work very much also focuses on creating, you know, what we call learning cultures, right? Creating spaces where we focus on learning, curiosity, like being open to new ideas and ways of thinking, whether through how leadership, role model this, or as we mentioned quickly earlier, creating space for organizational conversations and reinforcing kind of that way of approaching things. Talk to us about that. I mean, you mentioned earlier today, and you wrote in one of your publications that a common issue is that, you know, we do this thing once and we kind of forget about it. And it's just like, oh yeah, we did our diversity thing this year, as opposed to creating a completely new way of approaching those conversations. How do you, what are your thoughts about that? And some of the ways in which we can create an ongoing conversation, whether it's about unconscious biases or cultural differences or political perspectives.
Yeah, and I think, you know, where I've landed on it is it's probably a two-speed approach. You know, there's a part of me that can go straight to the, you know, this all needs to be integrated. It doesn't make sense to have these sort of separated, you know, like diversity, inclusion, bias, all that, you know, needs to be integrated in, you know, certainly the culture and in the other learnings that are going on, particularly at a leadership level of learning. It shouldn't be a standalone. However, I think there's this catch up that needs to happen, which does then require some standalone. But so what I will often encourage organizations I'm working with is like, yeah, we can do this kind of series of workshops or something to get everyone up to a foundational level, as long as that's followed up with, okay, what does integration look like? And that's integration in learning culture and learning opportunities, but also integration in processes and procedures and things like that. I will say that a company that focuses on learning, as so many are now, and you know, the whole idea of a learning organization, it's so key to being successful at diversity and inclusion, because the biggest key to diversity and inclusion, particularly inclusive behaviors, is curiosity. So if you've got a culture that says, hey, we are constantly curious, we're constantly learning and growing at all levels, particularly leadership levels, then you've got a foundation for people to lean into the concepts that are more often put in the diversity and inclusion bucket.
I mean, it makes me really happy to hear that, because curiosity is one of our values as a company, actually. And as you say, it's exercised at every level. Of course, it's exercised in the work that we do for our clients and in learning about new concepts, but it's also exercised in learning about each other and our individual contexts. So I think that's really great. And I think like that two-speed approach, I have many questions about that too. Like, do you think that companies that, you know, say we need diversity and inclusion training, it tends to start because they had issues or like something came up that created a crisis? Or do you see companies kind of doing this from day one because it's part of their own values?
Yeah, I mean, it's both, actually. I work with companies that, you know, will sort of say, hey, like, we know this is the right thing to do. We just don't know exactly what we should be doing, and we want to lean into this. And that's always really exciting, because and again, that's like a great example of curiosity and an openness to, like, we don't know what we don't know, so, you know, help us out here and set us on the path. But then you do get the, you know, organizations who are like, oh, we've had this problem, this thing has bubbled up, and most organizations, you know, there's always something, and therefore, you know, Jonathan, can you come in and do these workshops and that'll settle everything down? And I've had some tough experiences where, you know, I've learned that, you know, the executive thought this was going to quell the conversation, and I'm like, no, this is going to bring up the conversation, and you need to be ready for that. And you know, I'm much more at a point now where if they're not, you know, I would ideally just sort of say, look, if you're not ready for the conversations and you don't really want to lean into this, then let's not do it, because it's more honest. So, you know, and I think that leads me then to the challenge in those organizations, and I sort of alluded to this before, is some organizations want to lean into the grassroots and the groundswell, which is important, but it's also got to come from the top, because, and frankly, it becomes a retention issue. Because if you've got this passionate base, you know, and often you do, you know, your base is often younger employees who are more aware, more, you know, passionate about this, if they don't see the change happening at the top, then they're going to look elsewhere until they find it. And you have that sort of compounded by the problem that the further you go up the ranks or up the hierarchy, the more leaders, I think, are ultimately just really nervous, and they feel like they can't say what they don't know, and they're really just trying to manage their exposure. So when I do, you know, get to those opportunities where I can say, let's start at leadership, let's start with the CEO and their team, frankly, you just see so much relief on their faces when they can get into a room and actually admit what they don't know and start to explore. And then, of course, the advantage is they drive the messaging and it's consistent, and that's when culture changes. You know, matched with what's happening at grassroots.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful point. I think sometimes there tends to be this kind of, you know, oil and water separation. And the truth is, and I really love your point, and it's a very compassionate point, is that oftentimes leaders, they really want to do their best. Like we always tend to assume, like, yeah, you know, people at the top, they're assholes, but most people aren't. They're really just trying to do their best, but they really don't know. And the impact of one thing they say can like really explode, versus if somebody else in a different part of the organization had said the same thing, it would kind of been resolved quickly and it wouldn't have like erupted. We had a question earlier from Tada that I kept for maybe later, and I think now's a good time. Like, a lot of it is sometimes, and especially in the US, I think, maybe in other countries, we tend to be a little less picky with the words, but a lot of it is sometimes also around language that is being used. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, like, how picky should we be about words that we choose or how we express ourselves? Being in the American context certainly kind of gives you an atmosphere where choice of words is really, really very important. And I want to hear your perspective on giving advice about that to a global audience?
Yeah, I think it's, it's totally ties into this sort of idea of, we all, I think a lot of people have so much fear and insecurity around, saying the wrong thing, not knowing what the right thing to say is, getting, in trouble. The reality is there's no way we're going to get it right all the time, and because right is subjective, and even within communities where there's debate around the right language, not everyone agrees on the language that a particular community wants to be used. So we have to respect that reality. But I think where I see there's real progress is just the idea of, let's recognize by talking about language. So one of the ones that I will often do with a group is, I'll put out the term, hey guys, what do we think about that term? Hey guys. In most English language cultures, it's used broadly as a generic everyone. But it's gendered, and I remember when I was first challenged on that, because I used to say it all the time, and I'd be like, oh, everyone knows that means everyone, and the other justification I would use is, I know plenty of female leaders who say, hey guys, and so therefore it's okay. But a colleague challenged me on it a while back and said, well, it's gendered, and so I thought about it, and I thought, how hard is it for me to change that language? It's actually not. Yeah, I've been using it a long time, but there's plenty of other choices. Hey, everyone. Hey, y'all. Hey, team. Whatever, And of course, it takes a little bit of practice. But for me, that challenge made me so much more aware of language in general. And of course, I still make mistakes with that. I'll still walk into, it's funny, the things that I notice I say it with my family, which I have 3 sisters. So it's... it's deeply programmed at certain levels, but, you just keep challenging yourself. And in work environments, if I walk into a room and say, hey guys, I'll be like, oh, I'm trying not to say that. Hey, everyone, it's just that. And so I think people really, you see that resistance, like, no, I say that all the time. It's fine, blah, blah, blah. And then you see them start to wrestle with it. Like, well, maybe I could do something about that. And I think it's not just about that word or, and I don't have any, hard and fast rules that I would try and apply to anyone. But I think it gets people thinking that you can make simple choices and you can also be transparent when you mess up.
Yeah, so actually I wanted to ask you about messing up, because I think, for me at least, again, coming from a very different place, I think we're a lot more, at least the Lebanese, teasing is a love language. And so actually we always say like bad things to each other, but it's how we tell each other that we love each other. So coming from a very different cultural context, I often, look at diversity and inclusion as represented, in the kind of the business press and so on. And it just feels like we're creating spaces where mistakes are not accepted, right? And for me, also being like an agile practitioner and being someone who really believes in the power of failure, I really wonder about like, how much of it is it like, okay, we constantly have to pick the right words and make sure we're inclusive of everybody. And, like whether it's, throwing an event and making sure that everybody can make it there, or whether it's in a speech, or a lot of it is about like getting it right from the first time. But I also wanted to ask you about, what do you do when you get it wrong? How do you help teams or companies or leaders or individuals when they've said the wrong thing or behaved in the wrong way, most of the time not knowing that they had, so with no kind of malicious intent, but just they offended someone or they made someone feel excluded or not welcome? What are some of the practices to kind of come back from these kind of situations that you would advise teams to use?
The first, there's a couple of elements to this. The first would be, apologies are easy and simple and should be employed. I think sometimes, and it varies from culture to culture, of course, is when we have to look at that lens. But the first thing is to admit it, and to admit it as quickly as possible. Now, that's if you've given feedback on it, so don't try and defend it. someone's experience of what you said is their experience of what you've said, regardless of your intent. And so, that's the empathetic approach, right? It's, like, I hear you, and I'm sorry, and this is really good information for me, and I'm going to try and do better, and help me, keep an eye on me. I do think, though, there is this sort of middle level where on some level we often do know. I kind of call it the little voice, and it's when you're in a meeting or something and you say something and there's a little voice, and it's like, I wonder if that came out right. And you just kind of brush it off and move through. What I've learned is it probably is a good thing to address, even if it didn't, even if people understood your intent or whatever, to admit that in the moment, to say, hey, I just realized I said that, and I don't want that to come out the wrong way, and what I feel like I should have said is this, or sometimes in the follow-up, you might follow up with someone afterwards and say, you know what, I said that and I realized, what that meant. I was just thinking, I'm a gay man, and I was in a group the other day, and someone said something like, oh yeah, you bring the rainbow lights. And I was like, are they talking like gay rainbow, or just are they talking about, like, and, I wasn't offended either way, but, like, to me, that reminds me of the situation is if I say something that could maybe be perceived as connecting to a stereotype, even if that wasn't my intent, you want to either bring it up in the moment or circle back. It's not, I think that's about respect and empathy rather than thought police,
Yeah, I really love that. And it's really funny when you were talking about that little voice. I remember moments where my little voice is nagging at me for thinking that maybe I might have said the wrong thing. And honest to God, 95% of the time I did say the wrong thing. Like, that little voice is really very valuable, and we should definitely listen to it.
And I think it circles back to an earlier part of what you were saying is, you are then creating an environment. This is my hope. This is my optimistic hope, because yes, we are in a place where it does feel very treacherous. But if people are shifting, I think there's going to be less sort of call out, because the call out is a cry against unfairness, right? But if there's a sense, my hope is that if there's a sense that people are trying and people are open and people want to learn, that will remove some of the need for that sort of accusatory,
right,
approach. And don't get me wrong, like, there's times where stuff needs, I'm all for a little bit of protest every now and then. And,
Yeah, so am I. I definitely agree with you. But I think that's a really, beautiful, hopeful thought, which is that by kind of creating a better community, you remove the need for policing, right?
Yeah.
And it creates a space where people can continuously learn, share feedback, share that, this comment might have sounded the wrong, it might have sounded like what you didn't mean, but this is what it sounded like to me, and without also fearing that you then become like a victimized minority all the time. Like, I think on both sides of these conversations, there's so many complex feelings around bringing these things up. Like, for example, as a woman, I've always struggled or for a long time, and no longer, but it took me a lot of internal strength building to call out moments where I was being specifically referred to for my gender, or someone had made a comment about my capabilities related to my gender. For the longest time, I didn't want to be that person, like, I don't want to be the one woman in the room who keeps reminding everybody that she's the one woman in the room. And I think that having compassion about the fact that on both sides of that process, there's complexity in bringing up, in acknowledging, in apologizing, and moving forward together. It is a complex human interaction, and I think the more compassion on both sides, the better. So I think your hope is a really beautiful one.
Yeah, and I think both sides have opportunities. I think the problem is the weight has always been on the minority to sort of speak up, and so if we can, that still needs to happen, but we also need everyone leaning in to it.
Yeah, it's everyone's responsibility. I think that's really beautiful. And with that, Jonathan, we are getting to our rapid fire segment of our conversation today. And I'm going to ask you 5 questions, or ask you to complete 5 sentences with 1 or 2 words. And are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So the first sentence is, the one thing every team needs is?
Growth mindset.
That's a really good one. The one thing that a team needs to avoid at all costs?
Groupthink.
Brilliant. A good team leader is?
Transparent.
Oh my God, we need to have a debate. I'm going to stop right here. So I don't know if you listen to Esther Perel at all. She has a really beautiful kind of intervention in one of the podcasts where she's a guest, where she talks about trust versus transparency. And it's a very kind of paradoxical way of looking at it, but I want to hear your thoughts. So she says that if you trust someone, then you don't need transparency. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, but I also think transparency builds trust. And I agree that, like, as a leader, it doesn't mean you can be transparent about everything. And there's things that you do protect your team from, which you could argue that is not being transparent. But I think being transparent about the why, is just, I think particularly often I see this in new leaders, is that they're so nervous about, I have to be a figure of authority. I have to sort of seem really confident. And often that seems to, like, equate to not talking about your thinking processes, or not talking about the things you're weighing up, and therefore inviting the team's input to it. So that's where I see it. But absolutely, I agree. And I think once, they're interdependent, right? And if you have that trust, if you've built it however you've built it, then people aren't demanding that transparency, partly because I think partly it's already there.
Right.
And partly because they can kind of let go of there's any suspicions about your motives and things like that.
And I think that's a really great, I'm really glad I asked you about it, because I think communicating the why and the context is, to your point, something that not enough leaders do at every level, no matter how old they are. It's such an essential part of giving everybody the ability to contribute to purpose. I think it's so important. Sometimes we treat human resources as human resources. We forget they're human first. All right, next question. The best book on teams is?
Yeah, I struggled with this one. I'm going with Winnie the Pooh.
Tell me more. That's such a great one.
Because it's just, I was trying to think of a nice example of a collaboration of difference, right? Very strongly different characters who all bring something, and, we might recognize, we might have, both instant attraction and instant sort of, distancing from those characters. And, for me, the journey is leaning into all of those characters.
Oh, I love that. Which one are you?
I do like honey.
Oh, yeah. I think I want to be Tigger, but I'm the donkey now. I forgot his name. Like, I oscillate between complete madness and like risk aversion. It's always somewhere in the middle.
Well, and I think, and I think actually that the beauty is of talking about all the aspects, right? And this is often the problem with the personality typing, right? Is that, like, none of us fit perfectly into a category. So, I'm definitely a critic and a person who looks for problems. There's an Eeyore side of me, but I'm also an optimist. And, so it's like, I think if we can get to that place where we're talking about again, the outside of the kind of archetypes, stereotypes, etc., and talk about how we cross boundaries, I think we have much more interesting conversations.
All right. And the final one, what's your favorite team ritual?
This is a simple one, and it's go around the room. And I think what I mean by that is whatever function you have to get input from every member of the team, whether it's on brainstorming, whether it's on sharing a personal item, it's the opposite of, loudest voice wins. Because I just think you always hear, whether it's work-related, personal-related, if you give everyone an equal chance at the table to share, there's always amazing stuff that comes out of that.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And with that, we'll be wrapping up our episode today. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I learned a lot, and I really love
my
some of the
absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Like culture ad. I think I'm going to start using that a lot more. I thought that was really, really insightful, but so many other insights as well. As highlighted by our audience, you'll see there's quite a few questions there, maybe some that I missed, and you might want to go answer them later.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, and a huge thank you to our attendees and to everybody who commented. And as always, we post articles about Centaur Stage and about all the topics that we talk about on our website, cosmiccentaurs.com. So please go and check out our content, sign up to our newsletter, or follow us on LinkedIn or Instagram or all the other socials. And we also recently, I want to mention, launched our holiday campaign, and we have things around how to wrap up the year with your team, some nice retrospective formats that you could use to kind of look back and learn from this year, gift ideas for remote colleagues, whatever it is, you name it. We've even written one on how to run meaningful performance reviews. So go and have a look at all that content. I think it might help to wrap up the year nicely with your team. And then last but not least, do mark your calendars. Next Thursday, December 16, same time as today, 3:30 p.m. UAE time. I'll be hosting Sonal Bal, who's a career strategist and founder of Supercharge, and we'll discuss the roles of skills and culture in recruitment. I do hope to see you all there. And Jonathan, once again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Yeah.